One question, two views. You decide.
Is this ancient list actual history, or is it pure political propaganda? You've got two main camps in this debate. View 1 argues that the list is preserving a real, authentic historical memory. But View 2 says, nope, this thing was constructed from the ground up to support a political agenda. In each part of the series, we're tackling a different piece of that big puzzle. And today, we're zooming in on a really specific mystery. Why in the world is the powerful kingdom of Lagash completely missing from the Sumerian King List? And what does that omission tell us about what it even meant to be a king in the first place? Here's how the two sides line up. View 1 is going to argue that Lagash is absent for a simple, almost bureaucratic reason. Its rulers just didn't hold the right job title. Meanwhile, View 2 is going to say, no way. They'll argue that the very definition of kingship was twisted specifically to exclude rival models of power, just like Lagash. To really get into this, we need to look at three key arguments. Okay, let's jump right in with our first major point of contention. This whole thing really boils down to a fundamental question. What did it even mean to be a king back in ancient Sumer? So here's the deal. Could it really be that simple? Was this just an issue of classification? Did the powerful rulers of Lagash just not qualify for the king club because of the specific title they used? To get to the bottom of this, you've got to know two super important Sumerian words. On one hand, you have lugal. Now, that's the one we usually translate as king, and it seems to be about having power over more than just your own city. But then you have ensi, and that seen as more of a local governor, a city ruler who's kind of managing things for the local god in their temple. And pretty much this entire debate hangs on whether that difference was set in stone or if it was a lot more blurry in real life. And this is where the two sides really clash. View 1, the historical memory folks, they argue this was a clear-cut institutional difference. The king list wasn't just a list of every big-shot ruler, it was specifically tracking the succession of the lugal office, a special ceremonial role. And the rulers of Lagash? Well, if you look at their own inscriptions, they almost always call themselves enzi, administrators for their god. So from this perspective, it's not a political snub at all. It's just accurate bookkeeping. They simply weren't in the right job category. But View 2, the political construction side, they see something way more sneaky going on. They argue that this rigid distinction was basically invented after the fact to make the list look official. They'll point out that in reality, these titles were way more flexible. You can find inscriptions where Lagash rulers do call themselves Lugal, or even switch from Enzi to Lugal during their reign. So what View 2 says is that the list's authors deliberately rewrote the rules, narrowing the definition of kingship to only mean Lugal. And why? To take a powerful state like Lagash and rebrand its rulers as just local guys, effectively erasing a huge competitor from the grand story of supreme power. All right, so that's the title debate. But let's move on to our second point, because it's not just about what you call a ruler. It's about the very format of the document itself. It's a question of genre. Now, this is really fascinating. Could it be that Lagash was left out simply because its historical records just didn't fit the king list's rigid spreadsheet-like format? Or was that format chosen specifically to filter out states that didn't fit a particular political model? Let's break this down. View 1 suggests this was a practical headache, a simple documentary mismatch. The king list, when you boil it down, is a succession list. It's all about who ruled, for how long, and in what order. The people who put it together were probably working from sources that were already laid out that way. But Lagash's records? They were totally different. They're known for things like the incredible Stela of Vultures, which tells a whole story about a military victory, or for super detailed temple accounting logs. These things just don't give you a neat little list of kings and their reign lengths. So for View 1, the omission wasn't malicious. It was just a problem of incompatible data formats. However, View 2 argues that choosing that specific format, the succession list, was itself a deeply political move. A genre is like a filter, right? By choosing this one, the authors were pushing a very specific idea of power. One single king, followed by another single king, in a neat line. That structure makes a place like Lagash, where power was all about being a steward for the city's god, impossible to even represent. It's not that the information didn't exist, it's that the format they chose made Lagash's whole system of government structurally invisible. The genre itself was the weapon. And that brings us to our third and final argument, which really gets to the heart of it all, the motive. So, here's the bottom line. By the time the king list was being finalized, was Lagash just an old, forgotten power that nobody cared about anymore? Or was its memory still so powerful, so threatening, that it had to be scrubbed from the official history? Okay, so view 1 lays out a pretty straightforward historical case. Lagash's golden age came to a decisive end. It got conquered by its arch-rival Umma, and then later swallowed up by the Akkadian Empire. By the time the king list was being put into its final form during the Isin dynasty, Lagash was just a regional town, not a major player. From this perspective, there was no grand conspiracy to erase it. History had already done that work. The list was telling the story of who held supreme power, and frankly, Lagash just wasn't in that conversation anymore. View 2, however, says Lagash was left out precisely because it was an ideological threat. Think about it. The king list is pushing this clean, simple story. There's one divinely chosen kingship, and it gets passed down from city to city like a crown. If you admit that Lagash, a state that became incredibly powerful with a totally different system, was also a big deal, well, that shatters the whole narrative. It shows that power in Sumer was actually messy and complicated, and there wasn't just one way to rule. For a later dynasty like Isin, trying to prove it was the one true heir to that tradition, the memory of a successful alternative like Lagash was dangerous. So Lagash wasn't left out because it was forgotten. It was omitted because its story challenged the very political message the king list was built to send. All right, we have covered a ton of ground, so let's just take a second and recap the core tensions we've looked at in this explainer. Okay, so we've seen 3 key battlegrounds. First, the kingship status. Was the difference between a Lugal and an NC a real objective category, or was it a political definition that was manipulated to exclude someone? Second, the document format. Was the list structure just a practical problem because of the sources they had, or was it an ideological filter designed from day one to make rivals disappear? And finally, the political motive. Does leaving Lagash out just show that it had become historically irrelevant, or was it a calculated move to erase a threatening memory? We've now presented how both views explain each of these arguments. And as always, this channel doesn't take a position. So now it's your turn. What's your take? Share your view in the comments. And hey, if there's a question you'd like us to explore next, let us know below.